My background, I'm a neuroscientist, and I emphasize in how human brains age throughout the aging process, throughout lifetime. I try to approach my research from various disciplines using things like neuroimaging, such as MRI. I also am interested in looking at lifestyle modifiers. What we mean by that is such things like your activity level, diet, social engagement, things like that, and how that can have an impact, affect, or even improve your brain health throughout the aging process.
Fabulous, fabulous. I will look forward to reading some of your research. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jen. If you have any questions, please type those in the chat box, and we will. So, Dr. Jen, without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the Alzheimer's Association to provide you the latest Alzheimer's research update. So before we get started, sure, I want to talk to you about the mission, our mission at Alzheimer's Association is really to eliminate Alzheimer's disease through the advancement of research and to provide an enhanced care and support all those people who are affected. And most importantly, to reduce the risk of dementia through promotion of brain health. And the vision of the association is really a world without Alzheimer's disease. The work of Alzheimer's Association is really it's about people and science. And there's a lot of thoughts that have gone into designing the logo and what is simple, indicates and signifies. If you look at the Alzheimer's Association's logo carefully, on the left side, what you can see is actually a person. And on the right side is actually a flask. So that kind of just implies the relationship between human beings, between people and science, and how Alzheimer's Association's mission is really to connect the two and hopefully using science to benefit people. The association is a global organization working with advanced care, support, research across the world and not just in the United States of America. So in the foreseeable future, we are quite confident that we will be able to come up with better treatments and earlier detection, also some prevention strategies. Just like other detrimental diseases back in the day, cancer, for example, it used to be a death sentence, breast cancer, for example. But throughout the years, through advanced medical research, better education, better awareness, people who suffer or diagnosed with breast cancer nowadays have a much higher success rate to beat cancer. And we believe that Alzheimer's disease is also the same thing. We are at the stage that although there's no cure for Alzheimer's disease and there's no reversal of the condition, but with this effort of the association, in the foreseeable future, we're confident that we can come up with all these strategies. So this
Dr.
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the sound is kind of coming and going. Are you speaking through the computer or through the telephone?
I'm speaking through the computer.
Could you do you have a phone there, a desktop phone or your cell phone?
Mm-hmm. And what would you like me to do with that?
If you could call in, if you will go down to the audio, down to the controls to audio and switch over to phone, I think we'll be able to hear you much better.
Really? Is it an internet connection problem?
I don't know, but I had observed this on Zoom that if the audio through the phone just seems to be so much better. Do you see on your controls more?
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you go in there to audio, it should give you the option to dial in. I'm sorry I didn't catch that when we were talking earlier. It just seems like as you go on, it's getting worse.
Switch to phone audio. Is that? And in fact, let me test that. I am doing that. You can pause.
So sorry, guys. Thought we had our glitches worked out, but I think that you'll be able to hear Dr. Jen much better if we can get this switched over to phone.
Okay, so I've done that. Switch to phone audio, and it's not asking me to do anything.
It didn't give you a call-in number?
No.
Okay, well, let's try it. Let's try it and see if I'll let you know if there's a problem. Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. I'll try to be a little closer to the computer. Is it better right now?
Yes, it's perfect right now.
Okay, I think it's just perhaps just I need to speak up a little bit closer to the computer's microphone. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, this next slide, just wanted to show you all the collaborations and affiliations of the Alzheimer's Association with other organizations around the world. And in 2018, the association actually made its largest ever research investment with grants more than $30 million and awarded to over 131 investigators around the world. So some of these categories, if we break it down, 39% of this funding are meant to explore disease-related process, including brain inflammation, genetics, and the production of beta amyloid protein, which later we'll get into, kind of try to understand a little better nature of the beta amyloid protein. Now, 18% of this funding are investigating neuroimaging, brain imaging, biomarkers such as blood tests, and other early diagnostic tools. I personally am working on early diagnosis protocol, and that's what I'm focusing on in my lab currently. Now, 23% of the funded project are exploring novel treatment strategies and non-pharmaceutical or non-drug interventions. Now, 20% of the funding are really studying the ways to improve care for people with dementia through new technologies and how the impact culture has on use of these health services. So currently, there are actually no effective therapies that can cure Alzheimer's disease. There are some drugs that's currently available on the market, but as far as we understand, is that the efficacy is somewhat sporadic and it can only temporarily improve symptoms. Not to mention that some of the drugs actually have pretty severe side effects. And we understand that the disease modification versus the symptomatic benefit in treating AD is that the earlier that we intervene, the better. So earlier we talked about neuroimaging and beta amyloid protein. So here in this slide, I just want to show you some of the neuroimaging using contrast agents. The top three are what a normal aging brain should look like. And because these contrast agents, once you inject them into the system, they actually bind with those sticky beta amyloid protein quite well for a little time frame. So when you take these images, they light up like a Christmas tree, and that is actually a bad sign. So all these bright yellow and red and orange regions are indications of the existence of these plaques and beta amyloid proteins. So bottom three, that's a typical Alzheimer's disease brain, and these are the hallmark, as a matter of fact, of an AD brain. So this next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the disease progression of what Alzheimer or dementia or MCI. Sometimes there's a little bit of confusion of what Alzheimer or dementia is, what the differentiation between the two. So just to clarify, dementia is a big umbrella term, and Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia. Now, MCI stands for mild cognitive impairment, and we consider MCI as a sub or pre-clinical stage of early cognitive decline. So, in terms of disease progression, once you are diagnosed with Alzheimer's, there's actually no turning back. So the point of no return is likely to be prior to the onset of MCI, not the onset of the dementia or Alzheimer's itself. It's actually before the MCI, you need to be able to determine whether or not this person is going down that road. That's why primary as well as secondary prevention is almost as important as treating the disease itself. At least the consensus in the field nowadays is that we are really focusing on early detection and early prevention prior to even the onset of MCI. Now, some of the MCI patients may or may not ever convert to a full-blown Alzheimer's, but when you're diagnosed with MCI, your likelihood to convert is as high as up to 40% in the next 3 to 5 years. So that's why it's so important to have an effective diagnostic tool to be able to make those early detections even before the MCI sets in. So I get a lot of questions asking about drug therapies and interventions like that. Up to this point, I still have to advise people that short answer is no. There's nothing yet that has a concrete promising result, although a lot of scientists and companies out there, they're working really hard, and some of these experimental drugs are actually showing quite promising results, and all the way through phase 2B of clinical trials. So for example, Biogen drug between Biogen and Enzyme, this is a new drug trial, and they're all the way through phase 2B, as I said, and the how this drug works, the BAN2401, is actually an antibody meant to target on those pre-plaque beta amyloid protein before they become beta amyloid protein. So the idea is to get rid of those proteins before they even form and stay permanently in the brain. So at the highest dose level tested, 81% of these participants, looking at about almost 856 people who participated, 81% of these participants actually reverted and were able to show that the beta amyloid protein was removed from the brain. And now, personally, I always had this suspicion that beta amyloid protein is really just a byproduct of the disease, not exactly a cause, which is supported by the finding here, because even though with 81% of participants showing negative amyloid in their brain, this doesn't completely reverse or cure their cognitive decline. In fact, this was accompanied by 30% of the reduction in the rate of their cognitive decline, meaning that they're still heading down that deterioration road. It's just that not at the pace that was as fast before taking the drug. Nonetheless, these are still very promising results, because I believe drugs like this, when it's confirmed it will be able to provide people, the loved ones and the patient themselves, more time. Now, this next drug is quite groundbreaking and was supported by the association. It's called aducanumab. So these drugs is promising because after a 54-week trial, and depends on how heavy and how much dose you are administering to the participant, they are actually showing dose-response relationship, meaning that the more dose you're providing, then the more improvement you're witnessing. So this graph right here is showing you that in placebo group, which is the yellow bar of those 34 people, and later lost a few people withdrew from the study by the end of week 54. Those are the improvement, which we really didn't expect to see anything. But if you look at the 10 milligram per kilo in the navy blue bar, they are able to demonstrate or exhibit the most improvement. And these improvements are actually quite proportional, depends on the dosage that the scientists administer to the participant. So that is very promising, because whenever it comes to a pharmacological study, what you really want to understand is how much drug is enough to induce a clinically meaningful effect, and how much is too much, because after a certain level, you have to wonder if the drug efficacy plateaus and it's not necessary to go over a certain dosage. So these graphs show a very promising result of the aducanumab. The same drug, just a different way to present the timeline. At the bottom, you're looking at 0 week, and 26 and 54 weeks. And over time, with, again, the yellow line being the placebo group, the deterioration continues. And in fact, the sky blue, even though their symptoms improve, but they're still heading down that deterioration road. With a little heavier dosage, 3 milligram per kilo, and even a heavier, double of that, of 6 milligram per kilo, they seem to offset the disease progression, but nothing really reverse that course until you looking at 10 milligrams per kilo. That it looks like after 54 weeks, the disease course is actually flattened out. I wouldn't go as far as say this is reversing all the symptom, but at least you can see that it's more or less representing a plateau situation. So only at that dosage. So again, we are looking at dose-response relationship and trying to find out how much drug is enough and how much is too much. So based on the finding of this study, it would suggest that you probably need at least 10 milligram per kilo to have any kind of clinically meaningful benefit. Okay, so how about high blood pressure? Will treating high blood pressure lower the risk of mild cognitive impairment and dementia? As a personal bias, I want to say the short answer is yes, because currently what we understand in the field is that whatever is good for your heart is also good for your brain. There's still a lot of things we don't know about Alzheimer's disease, but we know that much. Whatever is good for your heart is good for your brain. So high blood pressure is also a known risk factor for mild cognitive impairment and dementia. However, a lot of researchers out there, they are still testing this theory by treating high blood pressure and try to determine how much benefit and how that will impact the disease progression in MCI and dementia. So we need more clinical trials to show this, which leads us to this next study, which is the very famous Spring Mind study. More than 9,000 people over the age of 50 with hypertension enrolled in this study. and they were randomly assigned to either a standard hypertension treatment or intensive hypertension treatment. Now, the intensive hypertension treatment is defined as keeping it under control lower than 120 millimeter mercury. So 120, that's very healthy. That's what most people at the younger age should expect to see. Now, the standard treatment, clinical treatment, is usually wanting to keep you anything below 140, and doctors are normally very happy with that. So these are the high number, which is the systolic numbers we're talking about. So of these 9,000 people, what we can see is that those who were assigned into the intensive treatment group, they really show a lot of reduction, almost up to 20% of reduction in the risk for MCI. So the intensive treatment appeared to be more beneficial and has more impact, but the take-home message is that the 120 millimeter mercury, that is the cutoff line. And that is promising as well, because as an exercise physiologist, as a neuroscientist, that tells me that there's more than one way to intervene and to do something for your brain health. Now, not only that, by keeping your blood pressure normal at 120 or below 120 of your systolic pressure, it also shows a dramatic reduction in the white matter hyperintensity or white matter lesion on the MRI. So what is a white matter lesion? You can consider those basically scar tissues in your brain structure, and once they die, and they just stick around like a scar tissue. So obviously you would prefer to have functional neural bundles and axons and connections talking to each other rather than having a scar tissue in your white matter bundle. So looks like from the finding of the Spring Mind study, those who underwent intensive treatment was actually able to reverse that and show reductions in white matter hyperintensity. So for me, that's very impressive. I've been studying hyperintensity or white matter lesions for years. I have not seen anything that could slow down, because a lot of that is part of the aging process. So this study result is actually encouraging and quite groundbreaking. So because of that, the association back in January decided to continue the funding for Spring Mind 2 study, to continue the investigation of the study and make it at a larger scale to make sure and to confirm the validity of the finding. Now, the US pointer, does a recipe that combine lifestyle interventions prevent or delay cognitive decline? Sometimes I get a lot of questions like, what type of diet should you consume? How much exercise should you do? Like, what do you really you can do to protect yourself? Well, the short answer is a little bit of everything. Got to keep in mind that Alzheimer's is a multifactorial disease, meaning that it doesn't have just one cause that triggered the disease progression. We understand that family history or ApoE4 gene does give you a higher risk, and hypertension is also a known identified risk factor. But it's more than just one thing, because a lot of times you see people with family history, they do just fine without the disease, and vice versa. So the US pointer basically is telling you the recipe is to do a little bit of everything. Well, physical exercise, as I mentioned earlier, whatever is good for your heart is also good for your brain. So for that, you can follow the recommendation of CDC as well as the American Heart Association of how much, how the frequency and the duration of recommended physical exercise throughout the week. You also can consider some of the dietary adjustments and follow the nutritional counseling and modification advices. Now, brain food, social engagement, social stimulation, cognitive engagement, those are very important in terms of healthy brain aging. So what do we mean by that is, for example, meeting new people, try to remember new names and new faces, learning a new fine motor skill such as using iPad or digital photography or even knitting. Traveling is also great because your brain is being stimulated by new sceneries, sounds, even smells. So all these exposure and all this cognitive stimulation is great. A lot of times people ask me that, hey, my grandma, she does puzzle games or Sudoku or bridge. Does it help? Well, initially, it would, if this is something that's new, that the family or loved one, the person you're asking for is actually learning this as a new skill. If he or she is already very good at playing these games, that learning process actually stopped and your brain no longer consider that as a new experience. So there's not as much of a stimulation there. So the take-home message is anything new in terms of social engagement or stimulation that and cognitive stimulation that is protective of your brain aging. Also, you need to worry about the improved self-management of health status. We need to consider checking our blood pressure, keeping an eye on our BMI or body mass index, things like that. So all these together is what's recommended by the US Pointer going through all these lifestyle interventions. So currently, a few countries around the world are in the joint effort to fight brain aging, and hopefully soon, currently, the countries in the purple or blue on my screen, including the US, China, Australia, even Singapore. These are the countries that are currently active, and hopefully soon, Canada, India, and other countries such as Italy, Spain, they will all jump in to form this global network to fight Alzheimer's and dementia together. Now, this is very new, that University of New Mexico's Alzheimer's vaccine study. I'm pretty sure that kind of made a splash on primetime news, but I do want to tell everybody that don't get overly excited because the vaccine itself is not yet available and it's only in the research stage only. And also, secondly, it's being conducted on an animal model on mice. So while the animal model looked promising, it needs to be translated to a human model in order to determine whether or not it actually works. Because animal models or mice or mouse models of Alzheimer's are very different from human Alzheimer's disease models. So if anybody try to sell you drugs like that, and you know that is false. And at this stage, patients and families probably not a good idea to ask the doctors for these type of drugs because it's not yet available and it's only at the experimental stage. So the Alzheimer's Association is currently diversifying and driving research through all these grant funding programs like Part the Cloud. It generated over more than $30 million in funding in Alzheimer's research. And we're looking forward to the next Alzheimer's Association International Conference taking place in Los Angeles next month, July 14th through 18th. And every year, at least over 5,000 researchers, scientists, and professionals, we all get together to discuss the new developments in clinical trial, diagnostic tools, support and care innovations, and prevention strategies. So this is a great place to be in July in Los Angeles. So in this last slide, I want to leave this slide with you. The end of Alzheimer starts with you. Thank you very much, and I am ready to take questions.
All right, you guys put your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box, and for Dr. Jen, I don't know if you can see this one. Miranda says, can you speak at all to the limbic predominant age-related TDP-43 encephalopathy? Something that she's heard about recently.
Okay, let me stop sharing the desktop. So I'm trying to open the question box. It won't let me. So let me stop the presentation here, and let me see if I can get to the Q&A. Got it. Think about the.
Got it.
Okay, this I'll definitely get back to you because I don't have more information regarding that particular research. That's something I'll have to look up and get back to you to determine whether or not the TPD-43 study. Just heard about this couple weeks. I'm not sure what we're referring to. Oh, okay. So about that, that's something that I can definitely look into and get back to you.
So while we're waiting for other questions, I just want to make a comment about, I love all the information you gave us about prevention. We are, we have 10,000 clinicians out there, and one of our goals in home health is to manage chronic disease, is to encourage our patients and to empower them, give them the tools to self-manage. So I think you've given us a lot of information here that we can use with our patients on why they should exercise, why they should try new things, stimulate themselves cognitively and socially.
Even though I mentioned that there's no current cure for the disease, but don't lose hope because it's important to stay active. As I mentioned, there's still a lot of things we're studying, but we know that much that if you do something that we've known for a while that's good for your heart, it really does help protecting your brain from the disease progression. And that is.
Oh, you're freezing up.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's kind of coming and going for some reason. I don't know why.
I'll go back to what I just said. Don't lose hope. Even though I mentioned earlier, there's no drug cure just yet. But a lot of things with lifestyle modification, it really does help, such as traveling, learning new motor skills, learning a new skill, learning how to play a new instrument, engaging people socially, and keep up with your physical activity level. All of these we know for a fact are able to protect your brain and slow down, at least offset the progression. So I think this question regarding LSU with the hyperbaric chamber. My thoughts on that is I'm highly skeptical because I believe that working theory of using a hyperbaric chamber treating Alzheimer is based on by providing more oxygen. And usually my question is, why do you have to go through that much trouble to provide your brain with more what we call brain perfusion, which is the blood supply that has oxygen and nutrients? Why not just go out and walk around the neighborhood and walk your dogs for 30, 40 minutes a day? Isn't that doing the same thing? Rather than admitting yourself to a hyperbaric chamber and to receive those treatment. Not to mention that hyperbaric chamber, it does a lot of wonders to wound healing, to carbon monoxide poisoning, but using that to treat Alzheimer's, that is a very novel attempt, and I still haven't seen any concrete evidence that will work. But understanding the technology and the human physiology of how human brains receive oxygen and blood supply and nutrient, I'll tell you that simply engaging physical or regular physical activity and exercise will pretty much do the same thing for you.
Thank you. Very interesting. Good point.
Well, people usually.
Can you see, Catherine?
Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I was gonna say that I think it's not uncommon that we're normally looking for an easy fix. So a lot of times we're hoping for one medical device or one drug that can take care of all our problems. That's why when you see an experimental study like that, people get very excited. But I just want to remind everybody that at this point we understand there's just no cure for the disease, but by doing everything in terms of modifying your lifestyle, know for a fact that it can offset the progression.
You're frozen again.
Okay.
Can you say that last part again? The screen is frozen.
Sure.
At this point?
Yeah, at this point, I think what I was trying to remind everybody that usually we get really excited and hoping that one medical device or one drug therapy can cure every problem we have. However, that's just not the case, at least not now. And just keep in mind that by doing everything that you can, that we know for a fact that is beneficial and protective of your brain, such as exercise and diet and social engagement, and keeping tab of your blood pressure. All these things will be protective of your cognitive status.
Thank you. And Catherine's question, I don't believe you've addressed this. I see many patients on the Alzheimer's drugs. Are you saying they're not helpful unless it's initiated early in the disease process?
Okay, I see that now. I see some questions in the Q&A. I see some questions in the chat. So I just got that.
They're both places.
No problem. I see many patients on Alzheimer's drugs. Are you saying that they're not helpful unless initiated early in disease process? They're helpful in the sense that hopefully to try to slow down the progression. Sometimes it also give them a good window throughout the day, or even have a good whole day when they're more intact. But the short answer is no. There's no one drug that has been proven clinically or have shown to completely reverse the effect. All these drugs are treating symptoms, not causes. Hopefully that answers Catherine's question.
I think so. All right, I'm not seeing, here's another one from Miranda. What do you think about the new study relating anticholinergic medication use and increased risk in developing dementia? That's a great question. I've read some of that information myself. I'd love to hear you address that.
Sounds promising. And again, what we know now is most of the studies also, previously I mentioned a couple of studies made it to phase 2 or even 2B. In fact, the aducanumab that I forgot to mention was at the pilot study result was so promising, it was actually being permitted and fast forward straight up to phase 3. And that's actually never heard of because he was able to show dose response relationship. So any of the study or any of the drugs that you come across have not made this far.
Dr. Jen, I think she's referring to the use like in people who don't have any signs of Alzheimer's, and discouraging the use of anticholinergics such as Benadryl, for one. That's a big one that's widely used. And avoiding those in people who don't have Alzheimer's, because there's supposedly some association with the risk of developing Alzheimer's or other dementias. Have you read anything about that?
I'm also skeptical about that. Like I mentioned earlier, Alzheimer's is a multifactorial disease. You can hardly prove that one single type of drug is increasing the risk for Alzheimer's. There's really no support for that.
Okay. Thank you. And now there's two other questions. Can you see those from Dale Irwin and Gail Inman on the Q&A?
On the Q&A, I'm scrolling down. Oh, I actually do know Dale. He's an attorney from Kansas City and a good old friend of mine. Sure, The End of Alzheimer's. I will have to catch up on reading that book. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you here, Dale. And let me look at Gail. How much does this stress? Wow, that's a very good question. For Gail's question, how much does stress influence the disease process? Is it considered stimulation or harmful? But then can you say what is good for your heart, good for your brain? Stress, there are different kinds of stress, but the short answer is yes, stress is bad for the disease progression. And I'll use a couple personal examples. My mother is actually at the very early stage of dementia, and when she is stressed, she becomes completely flustered, and this is a new development, and that's when I'm making the observation that stress can exacerbate the disease progression. And of course, at a higher stress level, people tend to be stretched into, pulled into multiple different directions, and of course, your cognitive capacity is reduced because of that. But over time, the chronic type of stress, I have enough reason to believe that cannot be healthy for the brain. And now, if we talk about what's good for your heart, is also good for your brain. The kind of stress that's good for your heart is not the same kind of stress we're talking about. The kind of stress that is beneficial for your heart health, perhaps we're talking about the physical stress when you have to endure going or bringing up your heart rate while you're doing aerobic or exercise, or a very high cardiac output type of level of exercise. So these are different kinds of stress we're referring to. But to Gail's question, stress does influence the disease progression a lot. There are a lot of good colleagues of mine. They look into the systemic inflammation in the brain due to stress, and there's a very tangible pathway and evidence pointing that it is associated, it is linked. So hopefully that answers Gail's question. Terrence's question, since high intensity exercise has been shown.
Terrence?
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, are we good?
Yes, I was just going to read the question. Go ahead.
Sure.
Yes.
So Terrence was asking about high intensity exercise being shown to decrease motor symptom in Parkinson's. What implications might that have using more specific approach of exercise? We use physical therapy to treat Parkinson's. So Parkinsonia is more of a dopaminergic, but I will never, unless the primary care physician strongly against it, I'll never tell anybody not to conduct high intensity exercise. Overall, it's good for your for your bone structure, for your muscle development. It's also got endorphin release that's good for your brain, and not to mention it's good for your cardiovascular and cardiopulmonary system. So, in the Parkinson's population, you can already see that by triggering different type of hormone release due to using high intensity exercise, it has a certain benefit in alleviating those motor symptoms in Parkinson's. Even though we don't know what this type of exercise can do for at least for the very later stage of Alzheimer's, but before the onset of the disease or even before MCI, I will never tell somebody not to do it, because it's always a good idea to conduct those type of exercise, just because I know how much benefit you can actually get out of it. Well, regardless your intention, whether or not you try to use that to treat dementia or not. I hope that makes sense.
Dr. Jen, you had mentioned earlier, I believe, the American College of Sports Medicine recommendations,
Yes.
and they recommend, what is it, 20 to 40 minutes a day of moderate intensity, don't they? Isn't it, what has been your moderate intensity can be enough? Is that the message there? It doesn't have to, we don't have to do that high intensity exercise to get the benefit. Can you?
Sure. That's a great question. So first of all, let me just kind of give everybody a little take-home cheat sheet or calculator. You can kind of grossly calculate a person's maximal heart rate by using 220 minus the person's age. So say if I'm 40, and 220 minus 40 is 180. So that's an age predicted maximal heart rate. Doesn't mean that's perfect for everybody, because if you train hard enough, you actually get to retain that. And people who are younger, sometimes their heart has a larger stroke volume because they're athletes, so they will never achieve. It's really challenging to get them to work that hard to bring up the heart rate. But overall, just in general, if you just take 220 minus age, you can kind of get a rough idea of the patient maximal heart rate you're working with. And I think some of you are well-qualified PT and exercise physiologists. You're probably very familiar with that. So if you're working with a client or a patient who is 60 years old and using 220 minus that's 160. To get down to what I consider a beneficial or meaningful moderate intensity, you will want to keep that 70%, if not 80%, to get the cardiovascular benefit. Did that make sense?
Beautiful, yes.
And so that's just the intensity. Now let's talk about duration. 20 minutes is great. About 40 minutes is better, because it takes the human physiological system or energy system a few minutes to kick in when you are working at a certain intensity, to bypass the first couple of different gears, if you know, for lack of a better word, without getting too technical. And then you are able to move on to a more sustainable energy system, which is the aerobic system. And if you want to get any benefit out of that, we believe that you need to at least keep it for 40 minutes, as previous research have shown that's the sweet spot that's required in order for you to get that cardiovascular benefit. And as we continue to emphasize, whatever is good for your heart is good for your brain. So while 20 minutes is great because you're still burning calories, you're still active, I would strongly recommend anybody try to prescribe this or recommend other people to have a exercise routine to keep it at least 40 minutes per exercise session. And if you do that, Do that for at least 3 times a week, because ideally we are actually recommending people to do that 4 to 5 days a week, and you can actually accumulate those minutes. It actually works that way too. So if you work out for 50 minutes and you do that for 3 times a week, that's 150 minutes. And for most doctors, they'll be very happy to hear that.
That's great. Great information. Thank you.
Just keep in mind on the intensity and the duration.
That's great. Thank you. Becky says there's so many different diets out there right now, vegan, gluten-free, paleo. Do any of the diets have a particular benefit for brain health? Is the best recommendation heart healthy? What would you recommend about diet?
That's a great question. Short answer is no. And let me kind of elaborate on that a little bit. None of those diets really mean anything. Paleo diet is not paleo because cavemen never ate what we consider a paleo diet. That's not even scientifically accurate. Keto diet, that's just a different, just a different form of Atkins diet on reducing your carb intake. And to be honest with you, carbohydrate is not scary. It's the excessive calories that's scary. In fact, your brain requires carbohydrate in order to function normally. So a lot of people going through Atkins diet or keto diet or any of those low carb, high fat, high protein diet, you will have a hard time concentrating throughout the day. That's one big drawback. Not to mention that your uric acid level will change. The science is there because human body is very lazy. It likes to break down sugar because it's the easiest thing to do to acquire energy, or ATP, adenosine triphosphate. When there's no more carbs or sugar available for roughly 48 hours, your body stops hoping for carbs and sugar, and in turn you start turning inwards to break down the next easiest thing, which is lipid or fat. So that's actually the science behind keto diet. But as soon as you introduce any sugar or any carb back to the system, the body decided, no, we're not going to do that anymore. Carb and sugar is just so much easier. Let's stick with that. So that's why in terms of weight loss, it might work for some people who can sacrifice and put aside bread and sugar and sugary drinks and stuff, but there's no evidence whatsoever that it can be protective of your brain. There are Mediterranean diets that's been shown to be perhaps beneficial, but studies like that, you also have to interpret the result with a little bit of caution. Because obviously Mediterranean diet study is based on olive oil and fish and a lot of beans, but food ingredients like that is already healthier. We knew that much compared to other poultry or even red meat. We already knew that's healthier. So does that really mean that Mediterranean diet is healthier for your brain, or it just mean that people from that region, they've been consuming fish and olive oil and beans for centuries, if not millenniums, and they tend to suffer less from the disease from a genetic factor? We really don't know that. Did you guys get that part?
Yes, I believe so. I believe it was cutting out, but I think everybody got it.
Okay.
And the only other question, Laura, I think that you already answered it about hope for people with early Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. Seems like the prevention measures always mentioned for late onset. I believe you addressed that, or do you have anything else you want to say
no,
about that?
I think the prevention, the early diagnosis and early prevention we want to emphasize is even before the onset of MCI. So things that that can be preventative are mentioned in the US pointer slide. That things you can do to try to hopefully live a better lifestyle. Unfortunately, for late onset, there's really not a whole lot we can do at this point. Now that I'm scrolling down to all the way down to the Q&A, I see Becky's question. So many different diets right now: vegan, gluten-free, paleo. I do need to mention that gluten-free diet is not a thing unless you have celiac disease, which is only 0.7% of the entire US population. So it means that if you're not clinically diagnosed with celiac disease, it doesn't matter you consume gluten or not. And if you are symptomatic, that's likely psychosomatic, meaning that you feel like you're gonna get sick because you think you have allergic reaction to gluten, and you consume it and you actually get sick. But statistics wise, only 0.7%, that's less than 1% of US population actually require or need or can benefit from gluten-free diet. Keep in mind, a lot of it is still a food and health and fitness industry fact. I'm from an Asian heritage, and some of our diets are actually made, some of the dishes actually made strictly out of gluten. And which is just a kind of protein that's a wheat comes from wheat. So just kind of put it in perspective. I actually had never heard of gluten sensitivity until very recently. And as I was doing some follow-up investigation, gluten sensitivity was actually a terminology coined by a group of Australian researchers about 7-8 years ago. And they actually published a follow-up study admitting that their pilot study had fatal flaws, and they should have never published those results. And they have published several follow-up studies to correct that result. But it didn't matter. I think at that time, American food industry just kind of just grab it and ran with it, with the entire concept, and introduced gluten-free diet, and the entire nation just loved to embrace it. Depends on what state you're from. But a lot of times people don't even need that diet. It just became a thing. So to answer the second part of the question, as long as you consume balanced diet, recommended a hard, healthy diet, yes, perhaps staying away from the red meat, that is still a thing. I personally just believe that you can't just rely on diet and hopefully try to be 100% healthy. Diet is just part of it. Being physically active and mentally healthy, that is a huge part of graceful aging as well.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jan. This has been very enlightening, very helpful. Your background, all of your backgrounds come together to make you a very interesting speaker on this topic, and we really appreciate your time today. Thank you for answering our questions, and thank you for all of the information you presented.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure, and any further questions, I'll be able to answer. If somebody want to shoot me an email, I'll love to try to get back to you with more detailed information.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And this information will be available in recording later on the Video Center, so watch for that. We'll put a note in the blast. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you very much.
Bye now.